Welcome to the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast, where we celebrate the craft of poetry. Each week we feature interviews with incredible poets, songwriters, and artists, including Olivia Gatwood, Safia El Hilo, Dana Joya, and many more. We also feature periodic submitted poetry episodes. Visit viewlesswings.com to submit your original poetry. I'm your host, James Moorhead, Poet Laureate of Dublin, California, and author of Canvas, Portraits of Red and Gray, and The Plague Doctor. Hit subscribe and follow me on Instagram or Threads at Viewless Wings. Francesca Bell is a poet and translator. Her debut collection, Bright Stain, Red Hen Press 2019, was a finalist for the Washington State Book Award and the Julia Suk Award. Her work appears widely in magazines such as Elle, Los Angeles Review of Books, and Rattle. Bell grew up in Washington and Idaho and did not complete middle school, high school, or college. She is the translation editor of the Los Angeles Review and lives with her family in Novato, California. Francesca, welcome to the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me, James.
Very excited to read your powerful new book. But I want to start with your bio, which hints at a backstory that is unlike what a reader might assume. No MFA or literature degree, no fancy literary arts education. In fact, no formal education past middle school. What was your path to a love of poetry, and what experiences along the way helped you build poetic skills?
So I first came to poetry through my sister. I was 4 and she was 7. And we used to memorize poems together out of an encyclopedia that my parents had. And we would memorize poems and then perform them for each other. And I suspect we dragged our parents into the room for the events also. And then when I was 6 and she was 9, I was jealous of her because she got homework and I didn't. And she had an assignment to write a poem for a class. And so I wrote my first poem at the kitchen table out of spite because I was mad that she had the homework and I didn't. And then, my mom got me a little collection of poetry when I was 9 because she saw that I was interested in it. And then we always visited the public library a lot, and I started reading poetry. And I have had some instruction. I've had some college. I didn't graduate from college, but I did have, I had a few poetry classes in college. And so I did have some instruction. And I think I've learned to write largely by doing it, and also by reading a lot. And I've had classes and workshops from people that have certainly helped along the way.
What an incredible way to start. I can't think of a better way to start than reading, reciting, and memorizing poem after poem. That's I wish I had done that early on. Memorizing poetry is not my long suit, and that is definitely on my checklist of things I want to get better at compared to other poets. So that's a wonderful way to start.
Well, my advice is to specialize in memorizing rhyming poems. Because that really does help, because your memory has something upon which to hang its hat from line to line. And I have several poems memorized. I think they're all rhyming poems. Other than my own poems, I have some memorized that don't rhyme. But that's partly because I've read them so often out loud.
Yeah. I've got a couple where I'm close just through the sheer fact that I've read them so many times. Well, what small sound opens with the unflinching lines? Every 2 minutes, an American woman is raped. Her body forced open in the time it takes me to tear this organic tomato to its pulpy center and bite in, letting juice run down my chin, stinging. There are many gut punch moments in this book, with these opening lines serving as a warning label and a wake-up call for the reader. How do you approach capturing such raw emotion while retaining the poetry, which not everybody can do well?
I don't know. That's one of those questions, if you could answer that, you could probably make $1 gazillion somehow. I'm flattered for that compliment. I'm thankful for that compliment, and I'm flattered. And I think for me, that's just simply the type of thing I'm drawn toward writing. And so if I'm writing a poem, it's not always, but it's really often about things that make other people uncomfortable. And I think that with any subject, you want to focus on vivid details, a lot of physical details and sensory imagery. I like to use a lot of metaphor. And so I think if you use all those types of tools, that poets use, you can build a container for pretty much anything. Yeah, I guess that would be my answer.
Yeah, no, particularly with poetry, you want this visceral response that's different than a novel where there can be elements of backstory that are not going to punch you in the same way. But with poetry, you've got such a small amount of space that everything is heightened. And I think that, yes, your book takes advantage of that space really well.
Thank you. I like to think of it a little bit as like with a novel, that's a little bit like how you're sprinkling something with balsamic vinegar, but then with poetry, you're using the balsamic glaze. It's been boiled down until it's really potent. And so that's what you're trying to do. When I revise, I'm trying to hone and to boil off the excess so that what you're left with is what's strongest, the flavor.
Oh, I love that. That's a pull quote for this interview. I haven't heard it expressed quite that way. That's lovely. Well, every poet I've interviewed talks about the challenge of crafting a book from individual poems. In What Small Sound, you've chosen to group poems into sections. How did you approach the challenge of how to order and group the poems in this collection? What was your method approach to that?
So I had no idea how to structure a book when I approached trying to put a book together for the first time with my last collection. And I actually hired someone to help me named April Osman. And she has a wonderful, wonderful essay that appeared in Poets and Writers several years ago that gives a taste of what she does professionally. It's what she does for a living, is helps people arrange their books of poetry.
Oh, interesting.
She does line editing also, but really her big specialty is that. And so she helped me with the first book. And when I approached this book, I wanted to use the things I really liked about how she approached my first book. And so the thing I love that she does, and a lot of people do this, but each poem has a little something in common with the poems on either side of it. And it might just be the color blue. It might be one word. The subject matter may be very different, the theme, the tone, all that could be different, but there will be kind of a little thread that runs through it. And so that helps me a lot if I'm arranging a book. And with this book, I went through the stack of poems I had collected that I thought would probably make it in the book. And I made a list of different themes, that were particularly prevalent in the poems. And so in this book, there was violence against women, a lot of mothering poems, hearing loss, both mine and my mother's, and sort of the peril that a woman faces in the world, and gun violence. There are several poems about gun violence. And I noticed that first poem, Jubilations, has a lot of those themes worked into it. Not all of them, but many of them. And so I thought that would make a good opening because it gives a bit of a clue what the book will be about. And once I had that first poem in the book, the opening poem, then I just started to look for, the next poem has, I can't remember what things connect those two poems. With some of the poems, it would be something as simple as fire, and they might have otherwise nothing to do with each other. I know what connects these two poems, the first and the second, is actually the restaurant that I talk about eating at in the first poem is the restaurant that burns down in the second poem. And the poems were written very far apart in time. That just happened to be something that was like a gift from the universe.
Yeah.
And then some people think that it's better to have sections, and some people think it's good to have a book of poems that just goes straight through. And I decided on sections because a lot of my poetry is difficult to tolerate. There's a lot of violence in my books. And so I thought that it would be good for readers to have a bit of a resting place. And so what I looked for was, you want to have like 12 to 15 poems in a section. And I was looking, for the ending poem to feel like a place that, a person could land. And then the poem that would start the next section, I looked for some small thing that it would have in common with the poem that ended the previous section. So there would be a continuation of the thread.
I love that. That actually, that approach has not come up in the many interviews I've done. So I really like that idea. And I did find your book despite the challenging subject matter, very compelling to read right through, which is not always the case. For a number of the interviews, books, they just are impossible to read in one sitting, regardless of length. Whereas your book just sort of pulled you right through, and maybe that was a subconscious thing that caused that. I don't know, but it really it was unlike other books I've read. It was very compelling to read straight through. Well, talking about challenging subject matter, the poem Rape Kit is brutally simple and impactful. A pair of list poems that parallel the justice system's rape kit with an imagined rapist's toolkit. Both lists are very moving, brutal, direct, in part because they're so simple. Talk about your approach to creating, revising, and editing this poem.
That poem is funny. I never placed that poem. Most of the poems in the book had been published in journals, and nobody ever wanted that poem, which didn't really surprise me. But one of the things that happened during the course of writing this book is that I had a very close encounter with a rapist when I was out jogging. And I had seen on television a show that talked about a rape kit, that many rapists carry a rape kit, and they have kind of the tools of the trade in there. And when I saw this man up on this ridge in kind of an isolated area, he had a bag slung over his shoulder, and he was walking ahead of me a bit. He had passed me and spoken to me on the trail. And I all of a sudden I kept having this thought, rape kit. And I couldn't figure out where it was coming from. And then as he got farther from me, he put latex gloves on. And I realized my subconscious was giving me this clue that, I'd noticed the rape kit. So that kit was something that was very much on my mind after that. I ran off, and he didn't catch me. I'm not sure if he came after me or not. I didn't look around to see. But so when I was thinking about how interesting it is that there's the idea of rape kit and rape kit, both, we use the same terminology for each of them, and thinking of what would be in each kit. And so they're not, each side of those lists, they're not exactly analogous to each other. I didn't achieve that, but I tried to have as much as I could that one side would play off of the other side.
Mm-hmm.
And it really was interesting as I looked up what was in, each kind of rape kit. I didn't really know. It was a little hard to imagine what would be in each kind. And I looked them up, and the lists matched up fairly well. And I always wanted to go back and write a poem that would be police killing and police killing, because that could be the police have killed someone, or someone has killed a police officer. And I think often we have these terms that float around that have these strange connections to each other, and yet are very divergent.
Yeah, well, I thought that was extremely powerful. And I think it reminds me of a poem I haven't placed yet, but I'm determined to at some point, or it'll show up in a book, 20 Ways to Start a Poem About Bullying. And it's meant to be gut punchy intentionally, and it's things that from when I was younger and got bullied quite a bit were all little vignettes, and I turned them into little titles of a poem. And maybe it's just poems like Rape Kit and poems like the one that I've tried to get placed. They're just too in your face for publishing. I don't know, but they're so powerful. So I've thought that's really stuck with me.
Well, just remember, you can put it in a book.
Yes, exactly.
You'll have the last laugh.
Exactly. It's going to get published one way or another. Yes. Well, the poem Breaking Eggs is visualized as tight phrases with space between each phrase. The poem begins, I cry when I bake, since that boy slugged you repeatedly in the head, knocking the numbers out of you so you couldn't count to 5, though you were 8. The disjointed form cleverly conveys the disorientation of being struck, the physical effect. Talk about how you approach the visualization of your poems, the use of space, using this poem as an example.
So it's funny. I tend to be a fairly traditional user of space, left to my own devices.
Mm-hmm.
I tend to. I actually was criticized for this when I was trying to place my first book, that I tend to write in, like maybe some things will have stanzas. In those early manuscripts of that book, some of the poems had stanzas, some were just block form, but I didn't do a lot of the popular kind of breaking apart of poems on the page. It actually really isn't genuinely something that appeals to me very much.
Mm-hmm.
And I can find it powerful, but I also can find it distracting when I'm reading a collection. But it is the style, currently, and especially when I was circulating my first manuscript. And so I actually went through all the poems, and that poem was in that manuscript at that time. And I spent an afternoon, this is like sacrilegious, but I spent an afternoon and I just called it remodeling. I just went through and thought, how could I change how this poem looks on the page to make it look more modern? I was like sprucing it up like you would a household. And that poem, though, I actually enjoyed doing that because at the time, it's very completely autobiographical. My son had a head injury when he was 8. And there was this stuttery kind of a way that the head injury progressed, both for him with his symptoms, but also how it was for us as it kind of moved through our lives. And so I actually enjoyed that sort of, stuttering through it. One thing I don't really like about arranging poems like that on a page is I think it sends a mixed message about how you might want that poem to be read.
Mm-hmm.
Because when I read that poem, I don't read it in that stuttery way, because I don't think that reading in that stuttery way is very powerful. And so, yeah, I feel a little bit hypocritical having poems like that where they're very broken on the page, because I think I'm kind of a traditionalist, that I think often when you choose your line endings and your line lengths, you're giving a reader a clue to how you might like that poem to be read. At least one possible way it could be read. And I don't envision somebody reading it with each of those stuttery breaks. So I actually have mixed feelings about that.
I think in this particular case, the form perfectly matches the subject matter visually. And I think, yes, you'd read it. And I included some of the gaps, but not all of them, because to do all of them, it would be completely unnatural. So that's a challenge. Yes, I think I write, most of my poetry is free verse, but some of it is in received forms. I've written a few Shakespearean sonnets recently where the form worked. I wrote a sestina recently, which ended up working perfectly, although I'm never write another one of those again. They're so hard. But I try to choose the form based on what the poem demands without paying attention to what's in vogue. Although at the same time, especially doing all these interviews, I am seeing forms where I go, that's a really cool way of expressing a poem. I have to keep that in the back of my mind for when the poem demands it, because I hadn't really thought of that before. So I think in this case, the form worked really well, this disorientation of being hit. But I agree with you that to use that where it doesn't make sense is distracting. So yeah, I'm more in your camp.
Yeah.
So Taking Your Place and other poems address mental health and suicidal ideation. And here's an excerpt. When the nurses didn't watch you overnight, I called the hospital to complain. The director sighed and spoke slowly as to a dim child. You know, he said, a determined person will kill herself no matter what we do. How do you decide which details to include and which details to edit out when approaching subjects that are so sensitive and personal? And that was another gut punch, powerful moment.
Yeah, thank you. So these poems are about 10 or 11 poems about one of my daughter's mental illness in the book. And so anytime I'm writing any poem, I go for the strongest details. And if I feel that a poem won't be able to be published because it's too much about someone else's private life, then I just won't write it.
Mm-hmm.
Most likely. And so my daughter was hospitalized more than once, and during this long dark phase in our family life, I really became. I was struggling with her illness, but I was struggling with my writing because there was so much I wanted to write about. Not so much about her particular, not like I can't write her experience of her illness, but I wanted to write about the experience of mothering someone through an illness like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then I also personally feel that we talk way too little about mental illness, and that there's this cloak of shame that we put around it that keeps it as if it's a private thing that we wouldn't have if, like if she were diabetic, or, or if she had, I don't know, if she had MS or something, then we would share much more freely. And I don't think there's anything to be ashamed about mental illness. I think it's just as if you have a cardiac problem. And so always when I write a poem, I'm choosing the whatever details will best drive the point home. And my daughter did tell me, she finally came to me 2 different times out of the blue. And I always joke, I've wondered if she read my diary. I'm not accusing her. I doubt if she did. She's very, very private, and she's a private person. She's respectful of privacy. But she told me that I could write whatever I wanted to about her illness and publish it. And that was a huge gift. And I'm not sure what I would have done if she had never explicitly said that. I can't honestly say. I generally write things, that are my perspective of something that has happened, and I do feel like I own my own experiences. And so there's a chance I may have published even without her permission, but I'm not really sure.
No, that's a fascinating breakdown of the thought process, and that you're the key thing I took away is that you're looking at this not from her perspective, but from your perspective as the mother. And that is something I'm sure many people can relate to, and it's also something that's your direct experience. I think that's a wonderful way to think about that for poets that are trying to write about challenging things around them. The title poem, What Small Sound, After the Hearing Test, and Making You Noise all addressed hearing loss in different ways. As poets, we are hyper aware of the world around us, every sense on alert. In After the Hearing Test, you wrote, I won't mind losing the clamor of cocktail parties, high grind of the dentist's drill, triggering retch of other people's vomit. Such a wonderful sequence of lines. What makes this poem so impactful is combining both the sounds you won't miss and those you will miss, which I've left out. People have to go check out the book to hear those. How has your poetic perception of the world changed as a result of hearing loss?
It's funny. I'm not sure that my poetic perception of the world has changed. I think for me, with my level of hearing loss, the thing that has changed the most is that navigating the world, like the peopled world, has become more difficult. And then even navigating the physical world is more difficult because I have hearing aids in both ears now, but I still can't track sound. I don't really fully understand it. But I will hear a sound that I think is behind me, and then the sound actually has occurred to the other side of me and in front of me. And so I'm really careful when I'm out, when I'm out running or if I'm out walking, and I look around a lot because I either won't hear something or I'll hear it in the wrong place. And so, but I still can hear well enough, that like I when I'm writing, I read my work out loud over and over as I'm constructing it. And I revise that way. I'm heavily dependent on hearing myself when I'm revising. And so I can still do those things. And I think those are the things, I'm not expected to become as deaf as, like my mother became really completely deaf. And I have a different problem than she had. So I'm not expected to become as deaf as she is, most likely. But that would be the tipping point. for me, I think for as far as it affects my poetry.
Yeah, well,
I think,
that point about the perception of where sound is coming from and the limitations of hearing aids, I'd never heard that before. So that's interesting. That's an interesting. You may have explored that in some of your poetry. That's an interesting, subtle point.
yeah, I haven't explored it that much yet. And I think it's interesting to me that I guess it's just like glasses don't fully restore you
Mm,
to see the way you would if you had normal vision. And even with the hearing aids, I still miss. I still miss a lot, and I mishear consonant sounds, and so I mistake words quite a bit, and so I mean it's hugely better than it is without the hearing aids. Um, yeah, without the hearing aids, I was really noticing myself just descending into my own world, really,
mm,
which was actually quite comfortable. But it's not that good for your mental health.
yeah. Well, you mentioned this earlier. You write about the epidemic of gun violence in the U.S. What advice do you have for poets looking to base poems on current events and create poetry that will remain relevant years later, so that it's not so tied to the immediate context and therefore has a shelf life? Or do you not worry about that and it's okay if a poem has a shelf life?
I write a lot from news stories, and I don't, when I'm writing a poem, I don't really think about whether it will have a shelf life or not. Um, and I mean, we would all be so lucky to have even one poem about anything that somebody read, 100
That's a
years
very
from
good
now.
point.
Yeah.
Yes.
But I do think that I think what's important to me when I'm writing a poem about a news story is that the poem isn't going to really be about the news story.
Hmm.
It's going to be about something that the news story brings up, or something that, like, I wrote a poem in this book about reading that the girlfriend of the Las Vegas gunman said that her fingerprints would be on his bullets.
Hmm.
And what was interesting, that was so interesting to me on so many levels. But for me personally, I have known and loved gun enthusiasts. I dated a man for 3.5 years who collected guns and was an avid shooter. I have known and loved multiple people who've killed people. I have, a cousin who spent 15 years in prison for murdering someone. And I didn't stop loving those people because of those things. And I could so relate to what it must have been like for the girlfriend, that she would have been left with still all of this love for him. And yet he had done these horrible things. I think he
Hmm.
killed almost 50 people, including someone from my town. And I don't know, I could relate to it on all of those levels. And so the poem uses the circumstances of the news story as a vehicle to talk about other things. And that's what I think
Hmm.
makes a poem, potentially last, even if it's about a quote unquote current event.
I think that's a beautiful way to articulate using a foundational element, but not having it just be that foundational element and be more than that.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, before turning the mic over to you, After is a powerful poem, yet so slight. Lines with only a few words and 3-line stanzas. The page is mostly empty. The poem begins: Once the body was wrenched whole from my body, I deflated. Every word in a poem is always important. That's what makes poetry such an incredible art form. It's amplified further in a poem like this. How did this poem evolve from the earliest drafts?
You know, um, this poem, I believe, it was almost lifted out of a free write that I did in my journal.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes when I do a free write, there will be a poem kind of embedded in it. And you have to be like the archaeologist, and you're just like brushing away things from the outside. And so this poem was fairly, I don't think I revised that poem that much. Um, and I had been thinking about, I didn't write it that long ago, and I have 3 children, and the youngest just went off to college. And so I have been grappling a lot with this sense of, I've spent almost 30 years deeply embedded in mothering, and and what have I done, or what does anyone think I've done? Or there's this way in which, as a woman, at least for me as a woman, I've felt this great emptiness. Like I'm this vessel that large things have come through, but I'm empty the way that a vessel is empty. And that was what I wanted to write about. And that one didn't. That was one that was easy to write.
Yeah.
Not very, you know how that is.
Oh, I know how that is. I've had a few where they just fall out of me. And
Yeah,
somehow
yeah.
they're just there. They've been there all along, and then I just chose to write them down, and poof, there they are. Yes.
Exactly. Or like you coughed and there it was.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, that was one that was sort of like that. Yeah, I've always wondered, if I have a hypothesis that those poems are ones that are sort of writing themselves inside of us as we're going through life,
Yes.
and that we don't even necessarily know it, and then there they are.
Absolutely. Well, now I'm going to turn the mic over to you to read selections from What Small Sound.
So I thought I would start with a poem about my experience of running into, almost literally, the would-be rapist up on the ridge where I used to run. And so I'm going to read this poem about that. One day, my body. I'm tethered since the man on the ridge, limited to the path between the backyards and the cemetery. This body is a rope that swings me over want's abyss. I am weak, succulent, a magnet for men who hide in the woods. I knew that trail, like the ridges of my own body that rose up and changed everything. It was my ridge, the way once it was my body, when I was lanky, straight, and invisible, before possibility unleashed itself month by month inside me. One day, there was a stranger on the trail, as one day my body curved out of control, making men do things I regretted. What makes a man want a woman dead or pinned unmoving beneath him? It's bright here on the fire road between gardens and graves. Vultures perch on the chimneys, wings spread to the new day. A deer's carcass rests in the creek beyond the chain link. I am safe here, in the open, among the already, always deceased. And now for something completely different. I'm going to read a poem that's about my mother. And my mother died in March. And it's been really interesting having this book come out. Then in May, there are several poems in here about her. And the title to this poem was taken from Robert Hayden's poem, Those Winter Sundays. And he closes his poem with, what did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? What did I know? By 14, I had lost all patience with her careful makeup, the fact that she ate cattle and swine and poultry, and said when asked that she would gladly kill anyone who tried to hurt me. She shaved her legs and had not read the diaries of Aeneas Nin, or Johnny Got His Gun, or the Ballad of the Lonely Masturbator. Failings I ticked off silently in the car beside her, those afternoons she drove me to the orthodontist she could not afford, so he could close the gaps in my mouth, coax my eye teeth from their Count Dracula positions, and give me, finally, the smile that would oil the hinges on so many of the world's doors. She cleaned up after construction workers to pay for it, paint thinners stripping her skin raw when she used it to clean spatters from the windows. For 2 years, my mouth ate up what might have gone for her to have new shoes or her own dentist. When her tooth abscessed, she waited it out, swollen and hunched in our kitchen, a woman pummeled by her love. I'm going to just read one more poem, and this one is about hearing loss. And you talked a little bit about this one, James. And the title to this poem is the first line. After the hearing test, it's 2 days before I cry. Grief sneaks up on me, the way sound does now, my ability to mourn as sluggish as my inner ears. Cilia do not rejuvenate. We have that in common. I won't mind losing the clamor of cocktail parties, high grind of the dentist's drill, triggering retch of other people's vomit. But I'd like to keep Telemann's trumpet concerto in D, the tiny chuff my python makes up close to my ear, the calls of 2 Canada geese as they circled the slough this morning, seeming lost, their cries trailing them like a woman's heavy train, and the indecipherable murmur of my beloved's voice as she held my hand while the bear ate my baked beans just outside our tent. Though I could not make out her assurances, may they burble over me forever. Loss accrues, the geese can tell you. It compounds like interest. O world, leave me slowly. Let me dally over each diminishing return.
As always, I say it's so wonderful to hear poets read the poetry in their own voice. It adds such a wonderful element to each of these interviews. Well, just a couple of questions to close. Congratulations, you were recently selected to be Poet Laureate for Marin County. I've been Poet Laureate of Dublin, California for several years now. For those unfamiliar with the role of Poet Laureate, how were you selected and what are your goals for your 2-year term?
Well, thank you. And you are sort of an intimidating Poet Laureate because you seem to do so much. So, in my county, they've had a few different types of, or I guess 2 different types of selection processes. In some years, they have taken applications and then they've chosen among them. There's a selection committee. And then sometimes they just appoint someone. And I was appointed. And that was largely because of the fact that the pandemic had sort of rent our program asunder.
Mm-hmm.
And it was unclear. And the previous Poet Laureate, he quit after just 1 year of his term. It was during the pandemic and he developed some health problems and he moved out of state. And so we hadn't had anyone in place for a while. And I think the committee just really wanted to try to get the program moving again. And I had been on their radar for a while. They had kind of hinted in the past that I might want to take this role on, and it never was the right time for me. And so when they asked this time, I said yes. And so my goals are, I'm very interested in sharing poetry with people who aren't poets.
Yes. Yeah.
And maybe that's something that all Poets Laureate share in common is this idea that it'd be wonderful if other people who don't write poetry could learn how beneficial it can be, both to read and to write, even if you don't want to publish. And so I just started this last month. So once a month, I teach a free workshop at the Mill Valley Library, and it's a generative workshop. And we discuss some poems. Last time we discussed some persona poems. This time we're discussing elegies. And then we have a free write. And then if people want to, they can share what they've written during the, after we've had the free write. I'm also hoping to somehow share my resources with writers in San Quentin. I mentioned that I have a cousin who spent 15 years in prison, and I was kind of his person on the outside during those years. And I have several other family members who've been to prison, or maybe some that are even currently in prison. I have a somewhat colorful family. And so the plight of the incarcerated person is very much something I'm familiar with, and it's something that pulls to me. And San Quentin has a long established writing program there called Brothers in Pen.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm in the process of working with the people, the instructors there and people who run it, to find ways that I could share my resources as poet laureate with people in San Quentin. And the first thing that we have, my first event in the prison is coming up in November. I'm bringing Anders Carlson Wee and Doug Manuel to Marin County. We're going to have an event at the Mill Valley Library in November. And that same day, they'll also visit San Quentin and will give a reading and give a talk. And they have a really, really vibrant writing program there. The inmates put out their own newspaper, and then they have creative writing classes in both prose and in poetry.
Well, that's been on my longer term to-do list with the Alameda County Jail, just 10 minutes from where I live. And yes, I would love to find a way to contribute, because I think writing can be, especially writing poetry, can be such a healing tool. Yeah. And just in more personal things that I've written I got mugged when I was 10, and it took me years to figure out how to, mugged in a Boston subway, how to capture that, hand over the mouth, being pulled. It's pretty terrifying. I got very lucky if someone showed up at the right time. But took a long time to figure out how to write that. But once you've written it, it's there's something definitely therapeutic about the analytic process of writing a poem and taking a little distance from it so you can really capture it in poetry. It just changes the experience a little bit. Yeah, and so I think that's super healthy. So yes, I'll definitely want to learn from you in terms of what works and what doesn't work. That's on my lengthy to-do list, since I have a significant prison very, very close by in Dublin. So congratulations on taking on that as a challenge. I think that'd be super valuable. So finally, what are you working on now, just in general, with your poetry life?
Well, I have had long COVID, and I've had this almost 4-year phase now where I've written very little. And I'm slowly getting better. And so I'm starting to write again. I'm really excited about that. And so I'm actually working on a series of poems about that. I love to write persona poems, and they're in the voices of objects that had some role. It could be passive, but maybe they were witnessing, but some role in an important historical moment. And so I just am working on revisions of a new poem that is in the voice of Abraham Lincoln's shaving mirror. And I want to do one in the voice of it's a pencil, but it must be like a mechanical pencil. It's quite fancy, and it was a gift from Eva Braun to Adolf Hitler. And so that's another. I have a list of them that I'm working on. So I'm doing research for that, and then I'm actually working on some nonfiction, and I want to write. I've started kind of a hybrid book that is essentially about caregiving. And it's mostly from the perspective of a mother, but that's not the only kind of caregiving I've done. And so I have some poems in there, and I have one essay I just placed. And so I'm dabbling in that, but I'm really excited to be writing anything again.
Well, first of all, I'm very sorry to hear that you've had long COVID. I've known multiple people that have had long COVID in different forms, and it's brutal and it's real. And so I'm very sorry to hear that, and happy to hear that you're getting maybe to the other side and able to write again, which the world needs more of your writing. And on the persona poetry, what a cool project. And if you haven't listened to the Everything is Alive podcast, definitely check it out. It is a series of, it's essentially interviews with objects.
Oh.
Where actors, here was the most recent one was, they tend to be pretty funny, but there's a lot of stuff you learn through them. The most recent one was a kangaroo and the child of the kangaroo in the pouch, except the child was now like a grown person a grown adult kangaroo that refused to leave the pouch, and the conflict between the mother, the very nurturing mother of the kangaroo that had grown up and refused to move out, essentially. It's just hysterical.
Right, yeah, failure to launch from the pouch.
There you go. And then they interview, they'll like really just, just ordinary everyday objects, like a bar of soap, and how the bar of soap, they know when they die is when they whittle down to nothing. Or they get forgotten or thrown away, or like it's just like really profound, and given your project, you will go through all
amazing.
those
Thank
episodes.
you.
Yeah, it'll give you a whole bunch of inspiration. Well, I want to thank you, Francesca, for sharing your poetry and your voice on the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast today. It's been wonderful talking to you today.
Well, thank you for having me, and thanks for all that you do. And I mean, your poetry is amazing, and then you do all of these things that benefit other poets and other people. So thank you for all of that.
Thank you.
The Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast is written and produced by James Moorhead. You can follow me on Instagram, Threads, and YouTube at Viewless Wings. Hit subscribe to be notified of every episode of the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast, and spread the word with your poetry community.